Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Funhouse alongside Mr. Martin Popoff. What's up, Martin?
Yes, doing okay. This is boy, this one's going to be a chaotic episode, but yeah, we've got nice cool weather here. It's probably I don't know what it is in Fahrenheit, 60-ish, 70-ish. It's pretty cool here, but yeah, ready to roll.
A little cooler here as well. Very cloudy. We got some rain last night. We've had weird weather the last week or so. It was really nice last week, and this week is starting off kind of not quite sure where it's going. But
Yeah.
fabulous shirt, by the way. Always love to
Yes,
see a
yeah.
Navy shirt I've never seen
This
before.
is my buddy Bill Bear, and his wife brought by a few shirts. I got a couple of nice Pink Floyd ones as well. But this is my buddy who's had the bad stroke, and he's in long term care right now, and hopefully things pick up for him. But yeah, he's got tons of rock T-shirts. And the funny thing about Bill is I turned him on to into a complete autograph nut. So he's got an amazing autograph collection now and stuff. But yeah, it's a shame he's been hit pretty hard with this whole stroke situation, but slowly doing some physio and all that sort of stuff. So we'll
That's
see
good.
what happens.
Well,
But
Bill, best wishes and hope you get better and on the road to recovery.
yeah, yeah.
So we've got an interesting topic here today, and this was a request from a viewer who wanted us to talk about this whole concept of timeless music versus dated music, right? Like what makes music timeless? What makes music dated? So Martin and I both like this topic, but we went back and forth on just how to kind of frame this. And we started to look at a lot of the different characteristics that can make music timeless or make it sound dated specifically. And at first we started coming up with more characteristics of what makes music dated sounding, right? So what we did was we kind of broke this down into categories, and we're each going to kind of take a stab at each category and comment on it. But Martin, I guess I'll just go over the categories real quick, and we'll see how this conversation goes. Like Martin and I already talked before we started taping that it's quite possible that we may do this in a second part, depending on how it goes, right? So, but what we're going to talk about are lyrics, instruments, fashion behind everything, the formats, the medium, the delivery, the genres. That's all one part. That right there is that screams like, oh my God, that's going to take forever. And then production, right? Production values, because I think what we discussed is that all of these contribute to what potentially could make something timeless, or on the opposite end, make it sound dated and very tied to a certain time in our history. So I'll let Martin kind of take it from there, and he's going to kick us off with the whole lyrical concept and why lyrics may or may not make music or albums timeless or dated.
Yeah, I was just worried that I'm just going to start babbling and I'm going to go for half an hour, and then all of a sudden we're not going to get through all these categories. But we'll see how it goes here. But
Yeah.
and some of these bleed over. I think instruments and production bleed over, and fashion's a little unfair, and it's not really about the music. So and then yeah, we've got the catch-all category with a lot of different things in it. So we'll see how this goes. But I think this first one is pretty straightforward. So yeah, we timeless is what we want this stuff to be. Dated is what we don't want our music to be, right? So dated, something you complain about, and you think, oh well, that didn't age well, right?
Yeah.
And timeless, it's like, oh wow, it's been amazing. It still sounds cool. It still sounds good. It still sounds fresh. Oh, that could have been written today, or even just indeed, it is still taken on by new generations, and it keeps getting streams or plays or sales, right? So that's the other sort of aspect of timeless. But lyrics is a funny one because I've got a few props here to remind myself. But we've often talked about Frank Zappa and the idea of dated lyrics, and he's such a perfect example of this, because it's almost like he knew he was going to put out lots and lots of albums, so he's basically reporting the news, right?
Yeah.
So you've got things like, well, let's start with the news. So something like I remember the Broadway the Hard Way album is so perfect because it's got a send up. So pop culture, this isn't exactly news, but send up of pop culture. You've got an Elvis Presley song on there. Elvis Presley dying, right? Michael Jackson song on there with him, his hair catching on fire in Pepsi commercial and stuff. You've got Jesse Jackson, Pat Robertson. Like, he does a lot of political stuff too, and it's all linked to the politics of, in that case, it's like
Tipper
1988, right?
Gore and all
Yeah.
that. Yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
Yes, yeah, lots of Tipper Gore. So you've got Valley Girl, when you had the whole Val talk craze, which is partially his thing, but also the movies, right? Think of Fast Times in Ridgemont High and that kind of stuff, right? You've got the songs about disco, right? So you've got all these songs about how disco is stupid and bad music and all this. So he's got a couple of them, I think. Dancing Fool and Disco Boy for sure. But yeah, I mean, he sends up all sorts of things. He's a parody thing. He's kind of like Mad Magazine, right? He's just that sort of deal. So Zappa is a great example of that, because it can be like all over the place with Zappa. But it's funny, this album here, Test for Echo, has a song called Virtuality on it. So this is about let's see, what do they say here? I can see the footprints in the virtual sand. Net boy, net girl, send your signal around the world. Let your fingers walk and talk. Throw it in the cyber sea, right? So remember, we had the information superhighway. The word cyber was used. So what I'm getting at here is you can be dated by talking about current technology, right? Or new technology. You got Jethro Tull with jtull.com,
Yep,
right?
yep.
Got an album called that. You've got Queensryche with the Q2K album,
Yep.
right? Yep. Everybody, some people remember the Y2K situation. A lot of people don't, because fortunately, the stupid thing about it is everybody say it was dumb. But basically, they threw a lot of technology at making sure there wasn't a disaster. So,
Right.
that's
At midnight, everything's going to shut down. We're going to be lost. Yep. You remember, everybody's
exactly. And because it doesn't now, because nothing pretty much happened, people kind of forget that whole thing. But yeah, here's Queensryche doing that. I just I was glancing through the racks finding stuff, and here's kind of a hot take, but Merciful Fate and all this talking about Satan stuff, are people kind of over religion? Religion's going down, in terms of importance, right? So is talking about all this sort of stuff dated, right? You've got all the Vietnam War stuff. So yeah, that well, yeah, I wanted to mention. I guess I didn't bring out that, but even in terms of like really early CGI sort of album cover graphics. I remember there's a Todd Rundgren album like that, I believe, right? But you think of Iron Maiden Dance of Death, and you think of the early crudely done computerized album covers. Yeah, and then on the flip side, I always found it fascinating when you think of so number one, like all the boy, girl, and love and sex lyrics and stuff is timeless, right? But so there are tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of songs like that are always going to be timeless when it comes to the lyrics. But every so often they'll throw in a make and model of a car or something, right? Or something that links it to time, something that links it to the era. And I always loved how we've always talked about things like Sad Wings of Destiny, or a lot of Led Zeppelin lyrics, where a lot of this stuff could have been written. I mean, Zeppelin, you might say a lot of it could have been written back to the blues era, whatever. But there are certain things, like you think of all that tyrant and genocide and all this kind of stuff, where you think it could have been written in medieval times or Renaissance times, right? Yeah. So there's a lot of lyrics that aren't dated. And then when we scour that album, then we think, oh, but there is Ripper, which is about something that's only 150 years old or 100 years old or whatever it is, right? Or Victorian time. So at that time would have been 80 years old or something, right? But yeah, so the flip side is, you can have timeless lyrics that aren't just the boy girl lyrics. You can have timeless lyrics that are just about ancient times kind of thing. And heavy metal's always been very good at that. Yeah. But then again, you can be very specific about it as well. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. I made a couple other things in my notes here. I can't even think of examples that have this, but I'm sure they're out there. The $6 Million Man, Mr. T, yeah, Andy Warhol. We know there's a lot of Andy Warhol songs, and that's not particularly dated, but literally, I can think of there are examples like that where someone will have Mr. T guest or mention the $6 Million Man, or mention some big hit sitcom or whatever back then, right? You just hear and your ears prick up and you go, wow, okay, well, we know when that was written, because no one remembers any of that stuff anymore, right? And the last thing I wanted to say, I guess this isn't a lyric one as well, but I'll just chuck it in here so I don't forget. But the idea of having guest stars on your albums who are then completely forgotten over time, right? And I can't think of any great examples of that, one that came to mind was, for some weird reason, was Whitfield Crane and Ugly Kid Joe. Because I think he's done some things like that or shows up somewhere, but yeah. So over time, you think of Alice Cooper having grunge guys around. So there's always those sort of those it guys, those star guys that you say, oh, you should get him on your album. And then half the time, those star it guys, their star fades. And I saw this in Banger Films as well. It's funny. You can think of, and I've had it happen in my celebrity sort of panel books that I've done. I'm in the middle of some of these now and thinking about this, but it's funny when you go back to something maybe like the Rush movie or things we've done in Metal Evolution or whatever, and you would go get some celebrities and put them in the thing, right? And then you look back at it 10 years later and you go, well, no one's heard of that guy ever again.
Right. What has he done? Right. Yeah. What was the point?
I guess he wasn't that important, right? He was a big star, in 2009, but
yeah,
no one knows about him anymore, sort of thing. So that's a funny one that happens. But yeah, the lyric one I always found kind of fascinating. So I'll turn it back over.
Yeah, I mean, you brought it up, the whole boy girl thing, and the lyrics about relationships and love and family problems and all this kind of stuff. I mean, that stuff, those type of lyrics are timeless because they've always happened. They always will continue to happen. It's not tied to an era or a date or anything like that. And one of the things I was really thinking about last night when we were kind of putting our notes together and throwing them back and forth is, like, if we fast forward 10 years from now, when so many lyrics over the past 2-3 years are just inundated with this whole concept of isolation and everything related to COVID. I mean, how many bands and artists have we seen where all their songs are about stuff that's been going on the last couple of years, the politics and all that? And 10 years from now, are people going to look back on it's like, yeah, that's all the stuff that came out there in the COVID era. We just want to forget about all that. That's going to be extremely dated come then, because it hopefully won't be relevant anymore, right? Just like kind of when you go back and listen to, you mentioned, Vietnam and Watergate and all that stuff, and the race riots and all that stuff that happened in the 60s, early 70s, people of today, especially younger people, might have a hard time relating to that because they didn't grow up in that time, and it's 50, 60 years ago already. So so lyrics about specific things and events that are happening at that specific time can get dated pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's a great, you brought up a good example, because I thought of, as soon as you started talking about today's politics, there's a lot of Trump references in all sorts of lyrics. And I think, so that immediately made me think of the latest Roger Waters album. And then you go back to Amused to Death, and there's all what war is that? Is that the
Gulf War?
Yeah, it must be the Gulf War at that time in that one. But yeah, so he's always had a lot of politics and stuff. The Gulf War is a perfect one. And then also all that nuclear war concern, that 80s thrash is sort of famous for,
right? The Reagan era. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, Megadeth putting, facsimiles of George Bush or whatever, in those Ed Repka album covers, right? Or Ed Repka putting them in. So, yeah.
All right. So our next category, which I will spearhead here, is the use of instruments, right? So what about certain instruments might make music dated sounding, where it's tied directly to an era? I hate to pick on the 80s first, but that's where I'm going to go here. So we saw a lot of in the 80s this use of drum machines and pre-programmed drums and really slick synthesizer sounds, right? Especially in pop music, general rock music, new wave, that sort of thing. In the 90s, we saw a heavily utilization of samples, sampling machines, electronics, especially in genres like industrial, hip hop, and alternative music. The 70s, and again, you can still hear it today, right? What decade was it common and expected that every song would have a guitar solo, right? I mean, the 70s, right? 80s for hard rock and metal, right? So because you remember in the 90s, Martin, all of a sudden, oh, guitar solos didn't exist anymore, right? So it's almost like you could tell 90s music for some of the things we mentioned already, use of samples and electronics, but also the lack of guitar solos, lack of musical virtuosity, right? Whereas in, you know, the 80s hard rock and metal, you shredding guitar solos, big riffing, all that kind of stuff. But even like the pop rock and soft rock stuff of this in the 70s, you usually had a guitar solo that was part of every song. um you know, keyboards and the evolution of keyboard sounds over the years. I mean, like the 60s going into the 70s, you had the electric piano was all, you know, the Fender Rhodes was got its start big time in jazz and jazz rock, as jazz started to become more electric. So all of a sudden you had what was known as traditional jazz, all acoustic instruments at the close of the 60s into the 70s, all of a sudden incorporating rock elements and electrified instrumentation and instruments. So all of a sudden that early jazz rock, jazz fusion period is very dated and notable for those formative years. So like 68 through like 74 or thereabouts. The Hammond organ, the emergence of the Moog synthesizer, right? So you've got bands like, you know, on the electric piano, rock bands and pop bands like Supertramp and others who are all of a sudden utilizing lots of electric piano in their music. Moog synthesizer, Hammond organ, you got the surgence of prog music, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, right? And Genesis and bands like that. Hammond organ, Allman Brothers, from Southern rock to rock, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep. On the jazz side, you got a guy like Herbie Hancock who is usually utilizing all sorts of things. So this kind of like explosion of electronic instruments, very tied to the 70s. Moving later in the decade, you know, the Fairlight digital synthesizer and sampler, right? All of a sudden, soft rock, pop, new wave, as we move into the 80s, utilizing this new sound, which to some people has this kind of sterile quality to it. Again, very tied to that time period. Flutes and woodwind instruments, folk music, tied to folk music, tied to prog rock, some pop as well, certainly some jazz. Again, very tied to the 60s and early 70s. The overuse of brass instruments, horn sections. Do you ever hear that today in popular music? I mean, you very rarely hear brass in popular music today, but going back to the late 60s and the early 70s, bands like Chicago, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, bands that were blending rock, pop, and jazz all together, utilized brass as a main part of their arrangements. You would see also around that time period real strings and orchestras and choirs, as opposed to duplicating it all electronically. Going into the late 90s into the 2000s, 7-string bass, 7-string down-tuned guitars, right? That heavy bottom end that's so associated with nu metal, alternative metal. Again, very, very dated for that time period. So we're talking like 90, 97, 98 into like the very early 2000s. Mellotron, right? It's a keyboard thing we talk about quite a bit here on the channel. That is very much part of the late 60s and early 70s as well. Moody Blues, King Crimson, Genesis, utilizing this tape machine, a keyboard tape machine, which was recreating the sounds of an orchestra or a brass set. Saxophone. You don't hear much sax in popular music these days, but all throughout the 70s especially, used quite a bit in rock and pop music, certainly jazz, right? But started to sound out of place in the 80s. I remember like a show we did not that long ago where on the UK Connection, where Simon, Stephen, and I were talking about the Huey Lewis album, the News, and how weird it was in the mid 80s to hear like a saxophone solo in a rock song. It's kind of unheard of at that time, but in the 70s, it was absolutely expected. And this whole thing, and you know, Martin and I talked about this not long ago, this whole idea that in today's age, 2023, to some listeners, especially younger people, a band like a power trio with guitar, bass, and drums sounds dated to some people, right? This whole idea of just like simplified instrumentation played by people, right? Where a lot of people come to expect music they listen to relying heavily on beats and samples and electronics, heavily produced. That's all pretty common and accepted now. So in a lot of cases, the type of instruments used will make something very, very dated sounding. But for music that is considered timeless, I don't know if the instruments used plays that much of a factor. Like, I kind of think that lyrics and production values, which we'll get into, have more to do with this whole thing of timelessness. I think that instruments make things sound dated or easily recognizable for the era that they came out.
Yeah, I tend to think like you know me and brass arrangements on these things, like they immediately take me back to the 60s and just really bother me. Or like, you know, I'm not talking about Jethro Tull flute, but I'm talking about just flute in old 60s pop sort of things. Drives me crazy. I can't stand listening to that, right? But yeah, a few things just to go back to the drums. So you had the Simmons drums and Lynn drums. So you had programmed drums, but you also had electronic drums, you know, that made the do 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 sound, right? Sort of thing. When you were talking about guitar solos, I remember having a discussion about slide guitar, how slide guitar is really not used very much anymore, right? And when you were talking about hip hop and stuff, you know, the whole scratching thing that started out early in hip hop that fades away and even gets picked up, you know, thrown into rock stuff as well, particularly new metal, and that's now considered a cliche old thing as well. And yeah, I guess just to add generally that whole keyboard thing. So the funny thing is Mellotron is cool again, right? I mean, Mellotron has dated well, kind of thing, right? Or it's gone out of vogue and then back into vogue, sort of thing. So that happens with some dated stuff as well. And all of these things, we can never have a closed mind to say they'll never come back in vogue again. They just might, right?
Because they always, in many cases, they always seem to. Yeah.
Yeah. But we'll get to sort of a conclusion at the end of what, you know, when and where that's actually happened. But yeah, you think all along the lines, like all those electric piano sounds and that whole farfisa organ sound in the 60s. And so now really the only keyboards you hear is you don't even know if they're done on a keyboard, if they're done on a computer keyboard, right? And basically synthesizery type sounds, right?
Yeah,
I
mean, there's now synths and other gadgets that basically replicate all the songs of all these classic instruments that we just mentioned. So you can have one little machine that can sound like a Hammond, a Moog, anything, a Mellotron. It can do it all. Electric piano. It's yeah.
But in most cases, at least in modern mainstream pop, there's no keyboard sounds at all except for synthesizer, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. So yeah, definitely, I feel like there's a lot of instruments I think that can date stuff, but the ones that drive me craziest the most. And then, you know, you think of Kenny G, and you think of, I don't know, what does he play on alto, like a clarinet or alto sax or something?
I think it's an alto sax, I think.
Yeah. So that high sound. Here's one of your favorites, John Popper and his harmonica, right?
Oh yeah.
That kind of thing. So that, I mean, that never became a trend, but it's like here's just something that's obviously linked to basically Blues Traveler.
Oh yeah,
else kind of thing, right?
And to even get more granular, right? So we didn't talk about actual guitars, right? But like the 80s, this whole idea of a Strat style guitar with a locking tremolo system like a Charvel or a Jackson or whatever, and people just whammy bar diving constantly. That's so tied to the 80s, right? Between hair metal and thrash. I mean, every heavy band was, you know, doing this stuff, playing those types of guitars and doing all that kind of crazy stuff. And I guess that goes back to, I guess, you know, Edward Van Halen obviously kind of jump started that whole thing. But yeah, that was such a big thing in the 80s.
Yeah.
You hear that sound, you hear that kind of whammy bar dive on a guitar solo. It's like, oh, that came out in the 80s, you know, for the most part.
Yeah. All right. My next category is fashion, but the interesting thing here is that I'm going to transition from this one because I wanted to make a point about instruments actually as well. So let's make the instruments point first. So Jez Woodruff on these first Robert Plant albums, he does all sorts of high-tech keyboard sounds, but none of them sound dated. I mean, it basically sounds like this music has escaped being ever called dated, and it's actually considered really cool. And what he did, for whatever reason, you know, whether he's a genius or it's by accident, he does. There's all sorts of technology on these albums, and they don't sound dated. They just always sounded really cool. Yet when you get to here, he's adding a lot of stuff that my buddy Ralph Chapman hates the idea of dated, and certainly when I talk about this album, because he did an epic contrarians on this. But here I tend to think he's adopting too many of the things that do sound dated in terms of keyboards. So yeah, but I brought these up to make the fashion point. So here's Robert Plant in 1982, and he looks great, right? It's like you know, this whole fashion thing. Sometimes on the positive end, you know, you almost think that almost nobody's going to escape, you know, being ridiculed for their fashion throughout all these decades, right? But it's actually not true. I mean, a lot of the times, the guys, you know, whether it's a mindset where you say, I'm just going to stick with what I like, and I'm not going to follow the fashions of the time, and for some reason, maybe what they're, you know, jeans and a t-shirt sort of thing lasts, has been around forever, and you don't get too particularly deep into the fashion of the time. I almost feel like Robert Plant kind of does that. And here he is in 82, and here he is in 83, and he's basically looking fine, you know. And he but then you get stuff like you know, the Rolling Stones and the Miami Vice suits, right? Dated to a time in the 80s. You get remember, we had our good buddy Peter Kerr on, and we were talking about skyhooks, and you've got this disastrous skyhooks picture from the 70s. And then you've got Slade and Sweet and all that really horrible looking glam stuff. But you know, I think of bands like I give credit to bands like AC/DC and even Aerosmith, such that they managed to you know, navigate the entire hair metal period and not look too disastrous.
Yeah.
You know, you think of Aerosmith on the back of the Pump album. You think of Angus Young. You know, where I always kind of joke that, you know, the worst it ever got was the purple crushed velvet version of the suit, and his hair got a little long and permy. But that's it. You know, they didn't succumb to the whole hair metal thing. And in fashion, you can talk about, you know, the early, you know, cowboy, the Avocado Mafia, singer-songwriter, country rockers from California, right? The whole troubadour thing with the fringed cowboy jackets and the cowboy hats and stuff. Hippie clothes in general. You know, punk, all of that punk fashion doesn't seem particularly dated. It's tied to a time, but nobody kind of ever looked at it and said that's uncool or it's embarrassing, right? It's just sort of, it was there. And
well, we saw plenty of it in the 80s and even the 90s. I mean, it just never really went away, even though the music kind of got out of fashion a little bit, but the fashion itself really did.
Yeah, and then the other funny one is the grunge fashion thing, right? So the lumberjack jackets or the plaid shirts or whatever, or even the shorts. And you know, you can look at old pictures of Kiss and Megadeth and see them on stage wearing that stuff, right? Yeah. Maybe not Kiss on stage, but yeah, you definitely see pictures where you know, these bands will, well, think of Rob Halford in the Fight era, right? With the shorts and the combat boots and stuff, right? So yeah, I mean, fashion's kind of a weird one where it seems a little unfair to bring up, because fashion, you know, definitely changes with the times and is pinned to the times. But it is kind of interesting how there are, you could find album covers, photo shoots all through the years where you think, they kind of got out of it unscathed. They didn't look too bad. So I guess we're dating certain albums based on the imagery, the look here. But yeah, it can be so bad that it does distract you, and it actually does take away from the music. So if I'm to make a point why this category is here, it can literally make you hate the music or not like the music or like it less because they look so ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, we commented, it might have even been the show we did with Guitar Hack where we talked about Max Webster, right? about how
Right.
the way they look on the album just totally dates them, and maybe was a blocker for people saw those images on the albums, they're like, oh, look at these guys, right? It's like, I'm not going to bother with this. But yeah, that can have a negative effect. Totally.
Yeah. Well, I'll just add, you reminded me, but platform boots, um, flared slacks. I forget about jeans, but bell bottom jeans. But so that's a good example of something where bell bottom jeans were out of style and then they're in style again. You had a whole retro hippie movement thing that goes on. You think of Greta Van Fleet, right?
Yeah.
But also even like the full on pantsuits, right? The full on costumery of those glam people. Leisure suits, the whole idea of the leisure suit or slash sports jacket thing, where you and I complained and talked about what Styx and all these punk rock bands look like, right? They're trying to look a little upscale, but when they do it, they look like the guy in The Office, but unfortunately in the 70s they had these hideous looking suits that they wore, right? Sort of thing. So yeah, you've got that as well. And of course, like we can get in the whole facial hair thing too, like the weird 70s look of the semi-short, semi-long hair, the big mustaches, the
Big
beards.
mustache with the beards and the sunglasses and all this kind of
Yeah.
stuff. It's like, what are you thinking? Something with the hats and things. Yeah, that's crazy.
That's good.
All right. Next category. This is kind of a big open one here that we have a bunch of things popped into. So delivery, formats, medium, right? How the music was presented, what format, and then genres as well. So we want to talk about vinyl, LPs, the original albums. So there seems to be this consensus that music that was originally released in vinyl format. So we're going way back. So we're talking 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. These records or these albums, we'll use the term album as the recorded piece, and vinyl, record, tape, cassette, CD as the medium or the format. But these albums that were originally released on vinyl are by many people are still considered classic and timeless because of the format that they were delivered on. And again, vinyl went out of fashion starting in the 80s and was obviously taken over by the CD technology. And in the 90s was kind of like a barren wasteland for vinyl. But as we've seen in recent years, that is kind of coming back. So even and a lot of these albums that we're talking about that originally came out on vinyl are even being repressed today, and people are still scooping them up, including lots of folks who were not even alive when some of these records came out. So there's something tied to both the music itself and the format itself. People think of vinyl as classic and timeless. We had cassettes and 8-tracks, which starting in like the 70s and into the 80s was kind of a way to make these albums more portable, so you can play them in the car, play them in the boombox out in the backyard. Can't bring your stereo system and play your vinyl out in the backyard or by the pool, right? But lesser sound quality, obviously, but more portable. And then you had CDs, which helped kind of bring music into the digital age, especially into the 90s, even more portable than LPs at the time, and arguably you can say whether they sound better, right, than vinyl. Some people do, some people don't. Then, you move into downloads and streaming as we're getting into the 2000s, people starting to move away from collecting physical media towards the ultimate portable format, which is, files or streaming on a computer or on a phone or on a tablet. Live albums, right? So live albums have gone out of date. This we could probably talk a whole show about this. So in the 60s and especially in the 70s and into the 80s, live albums were very, very popular because back then, to go hear or see a band live, you had to either go to a concert. You wouldn't hear live stuff on the radio, hardly at all, right? Unless you happen to catch some specialty show that would play some live clips or something like that. If you were lucky, your favorite band would release a live album, which would be either from a specific show on a tour or a collection of recordings from a tour. Video wasn't really popular then yet, but going into the 80s, you started to see, VHS and eventually DVD. But we started to see less live albums released in the 80s. And nowadays, Bands still do release them from time to time, but there's not a lot of buzz about them because, you know, every band tours, they tour a lot. And even if you don't want to go spend the money to go to a venue to see your favorite band, you can go on a place like YouTube and you can stream any number of shows, either recorded professionally or not by someone with a cell phone, any number of shows by any band. So the whole idea of releasing live albums nowadays is very, very dated, right? But I think because we haven't seen any notable what are deemed as classic live albums in so long, those live albums from the 70s, especially, I think are looked at, Martin, as timeless today because they're a snapshot of a place in time where a young classic band was captured live on stage when at the time the only way you could experience that was to go to a concert. You don't just go onto YouTube and see any number of live performances from throughout the decades. What else? So what genres might be a little dated? So, you know, 50s music, 70s bands making 50s music, the kind of the simple nature of like mid 60s music, you know, the whole flower power psychedelic era. You listen to something from that era and it sounds from that era, and you don't really hear things like that in the 70s or the 80s. And I think, you know, occasionally you do see bands trying to kind of recapture that sound today, but it still sounds from that time period. We mentioned like yacht rock, which back at the time was called soft rock. So back in the late 70s into the early 80s, you know, soft rock did very well, but it quickly became looked at as that dreaded, dated soft rock stuff from the 70s. Now, all of a sudden, yacht rock is making a comeback. So people, even younger people, are discovering, hey, these cool, breezy sounds of the late 70s, right? This pop music from the 70s. It's, you know, it's something that, and Martin brought this up when we were kind of chatting beforehand, these genres that sounded dated at one point and actually expired and died, but now all of a sudden are looked at as this is good again, this is fresh again, right? The hair metal stuff, right? The accessible commercial hard rock and metal from the 80s. That is very much of its time. You still have a lot of bands still doing that sort of thing, but once grunge came along in the early 90s, that kind of put the stop to that. And then you had the hair metal bands trying to be relevant, saying, oh, maybe we should do that, you know, like Dokken and Def Leppard and Kiss and Motley Crue and Warrant, all trying to do little edgier stuff that kind of borrowed from the grunge bands. How about solos, right? Especially live, right? So back in the day, you'd go see any kind of band and you would see a drum solo, probably a bass solo, especially in, you know, rock and hard rock and metal. Long guitar solos, you don't see any of that hardly at all anymore. You still see some of the older bands might do that occasionally, but for the most part, the days of experimentation and stretching out arrangements doesn't really happen anymore. Most bands, they come out, they play their songs, people want to hear them like they hear them on the original studio album or how they heard them on the radio, and that's become acceptable. An hour and a half show, hear all the hits, all the best songs as you like them from the album. No big solos, no lots of talking in between songs, no let's turn this 3-minute long song into a 10-minute long song. Very rarely happens anymore. So, you know, all these things contribute to what could make things timeless or dated. But it's just interesting to kind of like look into all of this. And even now there are people who are saying how stuff that was originally, back to the format, that was originally released on CDs now sound dated. And there's this expectation now that people want to hear the warmthness of vinyl once again to take them back to a classic period. So, I mean, we could go on. I don't know, Martin, if you have anything to add to this, but
yeah, I'll just be quick about it. You know, I mean, on the format thing, it's funny. So yeah, vinyl is not dated anymore. You know, a hipster will buy vinyl. I mean, it's basically the more or less thriving medium in terms of excitement. It's funny how CDs, you know, if you buy CDs, you're considered more old timey than if you buy vinyl.
right.
Cassettes and 8-tracks, it's like, you know, a collector of a band will go out and get those things. And as soon as you cross that threshold onto the computer, it's like the most embarrassing thing debate to ever say anymore is I downloaded it. I bought it on the computer. I bought the file, right? I mean, that's like,
Right.
seems like silly right now. So it's like you have the debate on the physical end, but basically streaming has taken over. Like, why do you need to, if you're enlightened, you don't need to own the computer file. It doesn't make you any more up a hierarchy, except that you paid for the music. But basically streaming's a deal there. And yeah, what else? So yeah, this whole thing about genres, yeah, it gets a little nebulous, but yeah, there are certain genres that completely died and never came back, and that stuff's always going to be looked at as dated. But I guess not always, because yeah, sure, it could come back, kind of thing, right? And there's always little nichey things trying to recreate psychedelic rock from the 60s or whatever. But you think for the most part, you know, uh, textbook grunge or textbook new metal isn't really back. It's morphed into other things. And there's a lot of bands, if you play them now and you stand back and you go, it's kind of 60% of new, basically a new metal band, right? With a few little tricks or whatever, and a smoke screen goes up, right? So yeah, I think that's kind of all I wanted to add there. I'll go on to the last category. So production. Again, the funny thing here, and I guess this kind of wraps it up and makes the big point, is that when it came to things like this, the Montrose album in 1973, Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon, things like this in 1976, and this makes the point as well. It got to a point where I feel like at that point, it became more about choice. You could do what you wanted. You can make something sound good. And those albums don't sound dated at all anymore. They just basically sound like correct recordings. And that didn't really happen particularly any much earlier than 1973. So I think you get this period in the mid to late 70s where you get productions that people then moved away from those productions in the 80s. But it's been proven over time that stuff, they were smart doing that, and it doesn't sound dated. And it was even proven, or use that word, underscored, when in the 90s with grunge and a lot of older bands going back to somewhat of a proper 70s sort of recording, where it's analog and you've got correct bass and you've got correct treble and not too many effects on things. And then in the 2000s, you get kind of a fine tuning using all the tools, 2000s and 2010s and forward, of all the tools that were there. But when I look back at production, something like this makes the point that I'm making here, in that you've got something like this is limited. This is not produced particularly well. It's got a little bit of that 60s problem, the 60s limitations, where you're not getting optimal bass and treble and good tones and things. And I think this is why 60s music did not escape being dated, because technology hadn't really caught up yet. So 60s is dated. 80s is dated for another reason. So basically you get to this and you've got your correct, timeless, sounds great album. Nobody's ever going to call the production of this dated. Although the funny thing about this point I'm making is that 5 or 6 years later, say when David Bowie was making albums like this, just for that specific brief period in time, you would go back and denigrate your old albums and say they sounded dated, because, oh, look at the amazing, great sounds we've put all over these records, right? And now, what's proven is that all of those 80s production techniques are the ones that are looked at as dated. So 60s is dated because of limited production. 50s isn't dated because they're all recording acoustic instruments and it's all sounds great. 80s is dated because of these embarrassing, production tropes that they put on. And basically, by the time you get to the 90s and 2000s, nothing there production-wise is considered particularly dated. It's just like, we know we can do whatever we want. We know they're making artistic choices at this point, and none of it sounds too bad. And just the rest of my props, we know Rush went through this as well, where all this stuff, lots of things that definitely sound very dated about Rush on this and on Power Windows and Presto and Roll the Bones, where, you know, Rush would have been looking back and feeling embarrassed about their 70s albums. But now over time, those things are widely looked at as classics by everybody, and that production is perfectly fine. And just a couple other props. So again, you know, this sounds dated, like I was saying about the keyboard stuff and the production. And then something like this is kind of a happy accident. I've always said about Golden Earring, they made those 80s production tropes sound really good. And for some reason, even though they're all there and you're hearing them a mile away and those red flags are going up about those drum sounds and Simmons and all that stuff, for some reason, this stuff sounds really good, even though it's using all of those 80s production techniques. So yeah, I guess my wider point, my wider point kind of across most of these categories is the late 70s kind of emerges somewhat unscathed for being considered dated, and people have problems with many of the other eras.
Yeah, and you know, it goes back to our original question: what makes music timeless? And obviously, it's in the eyes and ears of the beholder, right? Music is timeless if you come back to it year after year after year, decade after decade, and you know, it all ties back to music we grew up with will always be timeless to many of us. But you know, how do you explain young kids of today who are enamored with Dark Side of the Moon and Led Zeppelin 4 and Sticky Fingers and Breakfast in America and Hotel California, right? And the Montrose album and Kiss Alive. And, you know, you see young kids who all of a sudden are into all this stuff that maybe their parents found timeless, and they also are experiencing the same kind of joy with. So I guess there's no real definition of what actually makes something timeless, because, you know, there are probably plenty of people who think Dark Side of the Moon sounds ancient, right? And there's nothing timeless about it. So I guess it all depends, right? It's hard to say.
And anything could come back at any time too, right?
Absolutely.
So, and you're just, you know, you find it hilarious. I mean, even when Hammerfall and Primal Fear and all that came back, and Halloween and Gamma Ray in a big way, right? It was like kind of a joke, right? It's like, oh, they're making this old 80s music again. It's hilarious, right? And then so that came back. And so that's the other thing that happens. It's like sometimes I think there's a larger quantity of people when they go back to the 80s stuff. It's a little bit with a tongue-in-cheek aspect, but when they go back to the 70s stuff, you don't hear a lot of people just saying, I'm being ironic in liking this stuff, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's a little funny, it's amusing. But I feel with the 80s stuff, there is that. And so when anything might come back, that's been away for a long time and people made fun of for a long time, when it does come back, I think it's always going to have that ironic tag attached to it, right?
Yeah. It's interesting because, like, where I live, I have neighbors all around me and they all have like teenage kids. And I always like pay attention, like when they're having, like, the kids are having parties with their friends and things, and you hear the music they're playing. And like a couple of weeks ago, my one neighbor, and again, I think their daughter was having a party, and she's like, I think 16, right? And I was like listening to what they were playing, and it was this weird mix of like 70s pop and rock and 90s like dance club music. And I'm thinking, obviously, you know, none of them were alive when all this stuff, but it's funny how they're going back to music that's 30, 50, and 60 years old, right? And I didn't really hear anything like very, very recent. So it's just kind of weird what people gravitate towards. And you know, again, is that the influence of their parents? Could perhaps be, right? They're a little younger than me, but it's just interesting to kind of think about and look at is what people gravitate towards and what they think is classic music based on either what they grew up with or what their parents grew up with. So
yeah. Yeah, I don't know if we solved anything or
I don't
not.
know either, but
I think the overriding thought is that you know, I think probably the biggest takeaway has to be that idea of the production values and mostly the instrumentation and mostly even the look and everything of that whole late 70s period has kind of emerged the most unscathed out of everything so far.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head. I think you have to have all those factors involved to make a perfect storm, right? Because I think if we were to, let's say, take this one step further and go and identify 20 albums from this period that we're talking about here, and we look at all the characteristics of why it seems to be that people continue to gravitate towards this stuff and deem it as timeless, I bet you all these factors that we talked about are represented there. That's kind of what it's all about.
Actually, one more point is the idea that when people have these discussions about things being in vogue or out of vogue, it has to be sufficiently old enough anyways, right? So
Yes.
when things are not old enough, they're gonna be ridiculed as just, by a generation who's really thinking about these things 10, 15 years ago seems laughable to them. That's the stuff that seems really silly, right? But as always, they keep saying, give it a bunch of years and certain things will come back. And I don't really feel the 80s as 80s comes back in dribs and drabs, and it's usually attached with irony. And it's some people will focus on maybe the hair metal stuff or Tears for Fears or synth pop or Madonna. There'll be these little cottage industries in some of these subgenres, but I don't think the 80s particularly has come back as a large thing yet, even though it's now 40 years ago. So
I know, it's crazy. Yeah.
So maybe that's a clue that it wasn't timeless and it's going to be dated, and it just it's having too many flaws that maybe the 70s didn't have.
Right. Could be. Well, you never know, Martin. In 20 years from now, when you and I are both in our rocking chairs and talking weekly on Skype or whatever kind of video conferencing would be popular at the time, we'll come across two young guys who have formed a partnership on YouTube and are doing a show just like this, and they're talking about the same topics, except they're talking about 90s, 2000s, 2010s, 20s albums and what makes them timeless or dated or not, and they'll forget all about the old stuff. So who knows? Or maybe not. Or maybe they'll be talking about the 70s still. I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll see. We'll see. Anyway, Martin, what's going on your end? Contrarians and books. And
so there's the audio podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, and the last one was what is the next one about? The last one was that whole thing about this band Smoke on the Water. This one goes up tomorrow, and I can't remember what it's about. So we'll see. We'll all be surprised. Contrarians is going along. There's a couple shows go up every once in a while. That's our video channel, and then the books are all at martinpopoff.com.
Cool. All right, what do we got coming up here? Let's see. So, of course, in a couple hours, we've got Ken Golden and myself, Professor's Picks. Once again, it's Friday. It's a new album release day. So Ken will be talking about some of the cool things that are coming out today in the world of prog and metal and fusion. So stay tuned for that at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We got the UK Connection coming back at you tomorrow. We'll be talking about our favorite and least favorite albums from Motorhead. And then on Sunday, George Lemmy and I are tackling an almost impossible task. We are going to be ranking the albums of Animals as Leaders, the great prog metal gent fusion band from California, 3-piece that plays some of the most jaw-dropping music you'd ever want to hear, all instrumental stuff. Every album is spectacular. I still don't know how I'm ranking those albums yet, but we'll figure it out for Sunday. So all that and more happening here on the channel. So stay tuned a week from today. Martin and I'll be back at you once again. Till then, visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube all together all the damn time. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll see you soon. For Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.